welcome back. We are in Galatians chapter 1, beginning in verse 6. Thavmadzo hutiutos takios metatistes te apotukali santas imas in chariti Christu eis heteron evangelion. Huuk estin alo, ime tines esin. Hi tarasontes imas keterontes merestrepse ton evangelion tu Christu. Well, let's work through this text together. And there's a lot of grammar here. So, I assume that's why you're on this channel, is that you want to become more proficient at reading Greek or enjoy reading Greek at a particular level with others. And so we're going to spend most of our time on grammar, syntax, etymology, morphology, phonology, lots of different things in this particular video. So prepare for that and less theology. So, but let me just translate through this, and then we will kind of talk through it piece by piece here. So Paul starts off by saying, I am amazed, or I'm astonished that you are so quickly turning away from the one who called you by the grace of Christ unto a heteron evangelion, another gospel. And then he qualifies this in verse 7 by saying, which is not another, except except tines eisen. Some of the ones, there are some who are troubling you, and wishing to metastrepse, to pervert to evangelion tu Christu, the gospel of Christ. Now, let's do what I said earlier in verse 1. Let's just kind of get a lay of the land here. And I started by identifying the parts of speech here, just to save time, so that we can jump right into the syntax here. But this is what we have: verb, conjunction, adverb, adverb, and then we have verb, preposition, participle, and then we have second person pronoun, and then we have a preposition, a noun, a preposition, an adjective, a noun, a relative pronoun, a negative particle, a verb, an adjective, a conjunction, another negative particle, a pronoun, a verb, a participle, and a second person pronoun, a conjunction, a participle, an infinitive, an article, a noun, an article, and a noun. Let's just look at stuff and that just stands out. Okay, a couple things here. First of all, we see a verb here, and we see another verb here. So that's interesting that we have two verbs in really close succession there. We have a conjunction here which is going to give us a break of some sort. Something's happening here that is... So, something's taking place here that is going to break the sentence from... There's going to be a break here between what's happening in this half versus what's happening in this half, right? So we're going to get to that in just a minute. And then you've got this string of adverbs here that are together, okay? And then we've got some prepositional phrases, apatu kalesontos, himas. And then we've got another prepositional phrase, in chariti Christu. And then we have another one, is heteron evangelion, okay? And then you have a relative pronoun, which is going to have its antecedent back in this part of the verse, okay? We'll talk about that in a minute. And then you've got a negation here. You've got a to be verb here. So just be aware of that. And whenever you have a to be verb, you've got you got to pay attention to that because you could have, following that, for example, like a predicate nominative or something like that. But in this case, what you have is you have some interesting stuff. You have an adjective and a conjunction and a negative particle. But notice this negative particles, another thing to be paying attention to is may. So we can assume that the indicative is not coming, but rather something outside of the indicative. And we end up having a participle that's coming next. So we have a to be verb, we have a participle, we have here a pronoun, um, got another pronoun. So up here we have one second person pronoun. Down here we have another second person pronoun. So just paying attention to these things that we're seeing. We have another conjunction here that is linking these things. So like let's look at this whole string here. And we're going to see a linkage here. This conjunction is linking this half with this. All right, and then you have an infinitive, and then we've got an article on a noun, an article on a noun to kind of end this section. I'm going to double underline this as a verbal idea, and so that's really kind of the lay of the land. We're just kind of looking things over, making sure that we understand kind of what's happening here. We're also going to want to pay attention to this. This is going to come up important later on when we get into the actual syntax of this text. All right, so there's a lot there. I know the screen is busy. There's a lot happening there. But let's jump into it. Let me erase this and get a clean slate here. So Paul starts off with this present active indicative verb, thavmazo, which really just means to be impressed or to be disturbed by something, to marvel at something. It can be either positively marvel or negatively to be disturbed by something. And here Paul uses the word to identify behavior that he finds reprehensible. Then he uses this conjunction, and let me just say a word about this, because hoti is a very important word, and it's obviously very widespread in Greek and in the New Testament as well. Hoti is normally used in Greek to introduce clauses with verbs in the indicative mood. Functionally, it either introduces an element of content. So let's just kind of mark this out. So the first thing it does is it introduces content, or the second thing it does is it's causal, and it ends up introducing a cause, translated as because. So we would translate this as that, and we would translate the other use of hoti as because. All right. And context is what determines this. And so while either causal or content actually makes sense in this particular context, I prefer content here as it sets up a clausal complement to thavmazo. And this makes sense because Paul is explaining exactly what it is that's provoked his amazement. So what he's saying is, I'm astonished that dot dot dot, and what's going to come next is everything that he's astonished with. Okay, so I think a hoti of content works the best here. As content, hoti here functions as a nominalizer. So in Greek syntax, the term nominalizer just really refers to something that's used to change a word or a phrase or a clause into a noun or a noun phrase. And this word hoti reduces the clause to the level of a noun. In other words, one of its functions as a nominalizer is to reduce a clause to the level of a nominal. And this usage most frequently occurs in instances of indirect discourse, right? So when you see this type of hoti here, you're expecting indirect discourse to follow, in which In some cases, you see direct discourse as well, like a direct quotation, somebody's exact words. But in this case, you have really indirect discourse in which hoti, the clause, marks the content of the previously cited element. So the point is, he's marveling, he's amazed, he's astonished at something, and this hoti is going to give us content. All the content for why he's amazed is coming up next, and it's going to come up with these adverbs he's going to use to specify. So he says that I'm amazed that, and everything after that is the content or the reason why he's amazed. Now, this is different than as I said down here with this causal hoti, because with a causal hoti in that type of a construction, hoti functions as a subordinator. It's introducing what we would call an embedded sentence. And the embedded sentence has an adverbial relationship to the matrix sentence. So if this little graph represented a sentence and everything in here was a sentence, there would be another sentence within the sentence, and we would consider this to be the embedded sentence, and this larger thing to be the matrix sentence. What we see is with these causal hotis is oftentimes they can be introducing a subordinate clause, an embedded sentence, and the embedded sentence has an adverbial relationship to the matrix sentence. So adverbial participles function in the same way. They introduce an embedded adverbial relationship. So we're just talking kind of grammar here, kind of 30,000 feet here. Okay, so for example, we could say something like John petted the dog, and we would have what's called an SVO type sentence structure, subject, verb, object. Or we could say Jane kicked the cat. That's another SVO sentence. But if we wanted to introduce an embedded clause within a matrix sentence, we would use a subordinate structure like, for example, a participle. We would use the word like while. In Greek, for example, we would say something like, while John petted the dog, Jane kicked the cat. So, in that sense, Jane kicked the cat would be our matrix sentence, and the embedded sentence within that would be, while John petted the dog. It functions as an embedded adverbial clause to the matrix clause, which is Jane kicked the cat. So, while John petted the dog, Jane kicked the cat. And this whole while phrase is the embedded sentence or the adverbial, the subordinate structure, the adverbial clause to the matrix clause. So why do I go into all that? Well, because it's very important when reading Greek, especially Greek of a higher register. That's Greek with long, complex sentences, to learn to distinguish embedded sentences from matrix sentences. I can't stress how important this is. I mean, an embedded sentence is a component to a larger clause. And this is not easy to see when you're staring at multiple clauses which contain things like just infinitives and participles, for example. It's just something you have to get used to. So what's needed is just really just time on task. Okay, so that was a grammatical excursus, but hopefully that's helpful. So we come now to the third and fourth word of verse 6, and we have this string of adverbs here, where Paul says, hutos tachios. In this way, tachios is an adverb of manner. It means quickly. So we could say in this way or so quickly. So what Paul's saying is, I am amazed that hoti of content, that so quickly. And then he's going to move straight into a verb. So adverbs, though, let's just talk about this, how adverbs function, are a class of particles that are indeclinable in their form. So what they do is they modify verbs and verbal phrases, and that's exactly what it's doing here. In order to establish factors such as time, location, and manner. And really, those are the three uses of adverbs: time, location, and you have adverbs of manner, and that's the three really categories of adverbs in Greek. Um, and so they're modifying verbs or verbal phrases, and they're establishing one of these three elements. And so the way that we see adverbs show up most is with this hos ending. It's very common. Another ending that's very common for adverbs is thin, and so we'll see this quite a bit. And there's a couple of others, but these are the big categories of endings that we see on adverbs in Greek. And here we have an adverb of manner, establishing the manner in which they were turning away from the gospel. Now, this word tachios is used in 1 Timothy 5:22. And what's interesting about tachios there is that's where Timothy is warned against appointing anyone as elder in a hurried fashion. In fact, the whole string is adverbial. And here, what Paul is trying to do with hutos tachios is he is trying to heighten the rebuke. So the adverb is functioning like an intensifier by conveying a greater emphasis on the action at hand. And here he's saying it's not just that they've turned away, but the emphasis is on how quickly they have done so, which makes it even more egregious. And so Paul is right to be concerned. I mean, he's saying just notice how quickly these false teachers are leading others astray. This is not something that's happening slowly and methodically. This is happening very, very quickly, and that gives him reason to be astonished, to marvel. All the work, all the effort of planting and establishing healthy churches and sound doctrine and teaching, and yet it's so quickly they're turning away to something else. And so Paul is very serious for him how quickly these teachers are able to lead others astray. And then we come to this present right here. We come to a present mediopassive. Uh, we come to a present mediopassive indicative verb, and this is a second person plural. You can see from the ending. Metatitheste. What does it mean? It comes from metatithemi, and in the active, metatithemi in the active means to. I guess we could say probably the best gloss for that would be to transfer something, to metatithemi, to transfer something. But in the middle, and that's the active sense, but this is not an active. This is a mediopassive. So here in the middle, which is we have to make a decision. Do we see this as a middle or a passive? Here it's going to be a middle, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. But in the middle, it carries a different meaning, and really in the middle it means something more akin to desert, to turn away from, uh, to, to abandon. And so that's really kind of the to abandon an association. So what Paul is saying is, I'm amazed that you are so quickly abandoning, turning away, deserting. Sometimes as I said, it's difficult to know whether a verb is middle or it's passive. And so it's good to be aware of like how you sort of think through that. And so one clue to identifying passive voice is, let's just put passive here as a clue, would be when you see a passive, a lot of times you're going to see the passive show up with hupa plus the genitive to follow, right? And if you see that type of construction, hupa plus the genitive, this construction always follows a passive voice and expresses the agent of the action. So in this type of setup, you can expect a passive. When you don't see that, you may have a middle. But the middle in Greek I I think is particularly hairy. It's a notoriously sticky subject, but just to keep things simple, suffice it to say that when the subject of the verb either does the action to itself, so we call that reflexive when you're performing an action on yourself. And I would just say this is very rare. I think Moulton says that there's one use of it in the entire Greek New Testament. So there's this tendency in beginning Greek to translate middles as a reflexive, and it's just a really bad tendency. And we certainly don't want to teach students to do that because a reflexive use of the middle is rare. It's just very, very rare. And so if it's not reflexive, if somebody is not doing an action to itself or himself or herself, then what is it? Well, it's doing an action for one's own benefit. So for benefit of yourself in some way, you are advantaging yourself. There's something in it for you. That's really the thrust of the middle. And so when the middle voice is being used, I mean that's by far the most common use of the middle. And so you want to just pay attention to that. It's distinguished. This is distinguished from the passive here, in that in a passive, the action of the verb is being done to the subject, not by the subject. And so, David was hit by the ball. You've got David is the object who is acted upon. He is hit by a ball, and so this is the passive. Now, here in Galatians 1:6, when we look at metatisteste and we have a medio passive, and we're asking ourselves, is this a middle or passive? We don't see hupa plus the genitive. And we also look at this and we think, hey, this is a situation in which the subject is doing something for themselves in some way, not necessarily to themselves, but doing something in relationship to themselves. I marvel that you are so quickly turning away, not being turned away. That's true conceptually, right? There are false teachers, there are Judaizers who are coming in and helping to turn these people away. But he says, I'm amazed that so quickly you are doing this. So he puts the emphasis on you. This is the onus of responsibility is on you, not that false teachers have come in and turned you away. I'm amazed that so quickly you're turning away. And so you have this middle that's used here, and in the present tense, this is a present medio passive. So in the present tense, let's just talk tense for a minute. We have a present tense, and present tense is going to give us a certain aspect. Aspect is can be defined as the kind of action that's occurring. The kind of action. And so what we have is in the present tense is the present is giving us a certain aspect, and the aspect that the present tense is conveying is imperfective aspect. And imperfective aspect is telling us what Paul's doing here with that is he's telling us that at the time of Paul's writing, they were in the process of turning away. That's the kind of action. Imperfective aspect represents an event that is in progress, something that is continuous, something that is progressive, something that is repetitive in nature. And in the case of Galatians 1:6, they were in the process of turning away. And what's interesting is the process of turning away had not yet been completed. So presumably this means theoretically that it could still be stopped. And so, which is part of Paul's goal, is he's saying, "I look, I'm marveling here that so quickly, you are so quickly turning away, and that you're in the process of turning away right now, and I'd quite like to stop this. I would like to for this writing to serve as a warning so that you will stop this process of turning away." And then he gives us a prepositional phrase, which is going to be a modifier. And what he's going to do here is he's going to use a participle, and this is a substantival participle. And so Paul says, translate, I am astonished that so quickly you are turning away from. What are you turning away from? From substantival participle, the one who called you. This is the direct object. So I'm marveling at this, and just to bear in mind one more thing. So we're talking about this verb. This is the matrix verb. So in the sentence, this is going to be our main verb. All right. So we're going to come back to that in just a minute. But he says, I marvel that so quickly you're turning away, and he's going to use a participle from the one who called you. A substantival participle. What does a substantival participle do? Well, a substantival participle it does not modify a noun, but it stands in the place of a noun. It replaces, in a sense, stands in the place of a noun. So it's not modifying a noun like an adjective. It's actually sort of replacing it, standing in its place. Substantival participles they're almost always articular, right? And here's the definite article. And that's what you're going to see with a substantival participle almost always. There are a few exceptions. But the presence of an article and the absence of a noun are clear indications that you have a substantival participle. And you'll notice that there is no substantive in close proximity which has the same case, number, and gender of the participle, which is genitive singular, right? So we don't have a genitive singular noun anywhere in close proximity. And so this is another good clue that the participle is functioning substantively. The only thing that Paul does not specify here, however, is who is doing the calling. So he says, I marvel that so quickly you're turning away from the one who called you. So who is the one who called you? Is it, the options would be probably God, or the other option would be Christ. And so either one of those would be probably good options. For Christ, we do see, I guess, an example of this, of Christ calling, where Paul speaks about Christians being called by Christ in Romans 1:6. So that certainly has precedent. Although being called by God, speaking more of the Father, is certainly more normal of an expression. And so even though this one is not unprecedented, more likely I favor, God the Father given the particular context. And so probably he's saying, I marvel that so quickly you're turning away from the one who called you, namely God the Father. And notice there's no referent. It simply says the one calling you. If you look up the root word here, which is kaleo, if you look up this root word in Paul, and you find out that the referent is ambiguous, if you see that the referent is ambiguous, the subject is almost always God. It's just what happens. And so the Father is probably the referent. He is the one calling you. What is kaleo? What does it mean? Um, well, in short, kaleo is just really, it's really just a verb that means to be chosen for a special benefit or an experience. Um, and so, one thing that we do want to mention about this verb is we see here that we have an epsilon contract verb. And normally you would expect to see with kaleo, you would expect to see a lengthened eta because outside of the first principal part, the stem with epsilon is going to lengthen to an eta. Oops. That you're going to see this process take place. But this verb is simply one of those verbs that does not lengthen. And so, in a sense, kaleo is considered a bit of an anomaly or an exception. There are a few other verbs that do this. These are roots ending in epsilon. So, again, you have the root ends here in epsilon, right? And when the root ends in epsilon, you're expecting typically the epsilon to lengthen to an eta before the tense formative, which is here, okay? But it does not lengthen. If you look here, it's not lengthening. This is one of these exceptions. You would typically see that lengthen. There are about 10 such examples in the New Testament, of which kaleo is one. Some of the other more popular ones, just that I know by heart, is neo, which means to praise. Let's see, what else? I mean, another one would be is deo. That's to bind or tie. Okay, and then I think I'll have to look. I think teleo is another one, which teleo would mean to the word telos, end, goal, so to bring to an end, to finish or to complete. Okay, so these are other examples of you see this epsilon, epsilon, epsilon here, of again where the epsilon does not lengthen to an eta before the tense formative. So it's just a word on morphology there. It's good to be aware of that, and that's why in these videos when we're talking about everything from morphology to idioms to basic grammar and syntax, really just trying to cover it all and be really in depth with the analysis. I am marveling that you are so quickly turning away from the one who called you, direct object. And then we've got a dative prepositional phrase, which is going to be a modifier. And then you've got another prepositional phrase here, which is going to be another modifier, okay? And these prepositional phrases are going to be coming off verbals. So, eis evangelion, eis heteron evangelion is a prepositional phrase that is modifying this verb, and in chariti Christou is a prepositional phrase that is modifying this participle. Oops, if I can get my line over here. Here we go. Okay, and so if we were going to diagram this out, you would see. Well, let me show you a diagram here in a minute. All right, so but just track with me. So what we're talking about here is the participle is being modified by this prepositional phrase in chariti Christou. And so what he's saying is, I marvel that so quickly you are turning away from the one who called you. And then we have in plus the dative. By the grace of Christ, we could translate. Galatians is a really interesting case study in the flexibility of, and this is another idiom that we see, in plus the dative. in Greek. And so Galatians is a really great case study of in plus the dative. I mean, if you look up all the uses in Galatians, you'll see that there's a lot of different ideas and forces behind in plus the dative. And here it's probably equivalent to what Wallace and others would call a dative of means. It's the means by which something takes place. He called you by means of the grace of Christ. And when we get later into the chapter, you're going to see this in plus the dative, which is going to show up again, and in plus the dative phrases where it's like at the end of the chapter, each in plus the dative seems to carry a different nuance. And this is sometimes also referred to dative of means as an instrumental dative, which is identifying the instrument or force behind something. And so either terminology works. It's simply the means or the instrument by which a verbal action is accomplished. Another option. So let's call that option 1 here for in plus the dative. Option 2 could potentially be a dative of manner. And this is a slightly different idea, but a dative of manner would be indicating the manner in which he called you. So we would say something like, I mean, if we're going to translate this, something like, he graciously called you. And and that, if that is what that's it's very certainly within the realm of possibility that's what in plus the dative here is conveying. That's certainly possible. Now, I prefer to tip my hand an instrumental dative or a dative of means here. So I prefer number 1 here, but certainly number 2 is an option, and it is legitimate, although it gives us a very different translation, right? So I marvel that so quickly you are turning away from the one who called you by the grace of Christ, or that you're so quickly turning away from the one who graciously called you. And so it's a similar idea, but it's certainly a different translation and gives a different feel and a different nuance. And that's why translation is not an exact science. And Luther was famous for saying all translation is treason. And this is why, because when you're moving from a source language into a target language, things are going to get missed. You know that game where person 1 whispers something to person 2, who whispers something to person 3, and by the time you get down to like person 12, like the message is just not accurate, right? And so just even this process of trying to move from source to target, and even if you're working with what we would call, functional equivalency, kind of this word by word idea, there's still not a one for one transfer of a Greek word into an English expression always. And so we don't have a good English word, let's say, for maybe this Greek word that we're trying to convey. And so translation is not an exact science. It's difficult, it's hard, and that's why those who labor in that effort should be commended. And we should also, be super respectful of those who have given and dedicated their very lives to making sure that we get this as accurately as possible. So dative of manner or dative of means, I prefer a dative of manner here. Notice one other thing that I want to mention is that I'm just going to change the pen colors to vary this up. We're going to notice here that Christou here is in brackets. Why is it in brackets? Well, that's because it does not appear in some of our earliest manuscripts. For example, in P46, or in any of the quotations of this verse from Tertullian and also from Cyprian, I I know this because I looked at the critical apparatus as soon as I saw Christou was in brackets, and I wanted to see what's going on here. And so a lot of these verses are reconstructed by looking at quotations from people like Tertullian, Cyprian, and others, and we see that it's not there. It's not found in Tertullian. It's not found in Cyprian. That is, Christou is not there. It's also not in P46. It's one of our oldest manuscripts. P52 happens to be the oldest that we have, which is a fragment of John 18. I think it's 31 to 33. But P46 is also very, very old. And so it's not there. So Metzger, in his commentary, says, on textual critical commentary, says that Christou was likely inserted later, and thus it's not original. The New English Bible, which I enjoy reading from Cambridge and Oxford, does not include it in its translation at all. A lot of English translations will include it, but again, they'll bracket out Christ. So let's assume for a minute that it's not there, which is by putting this in brackets, the authors of the Nestle Aland text are telling you, hey, this is questionable. So we're going to put it in brackets. So if it's not there, it doesn't matter. It's not really changing anything. Thavmadzo hotihutos takios maritistes te apatu kalisantas imas. You're so quickly turning away from the one who called you by grace, or from the one who called you graciously. And the point is, he called you graciously, or he called you by grace, and we're going to have another modifier here. Is heteron evangelion, unto another gospel, or unto another message of good news. Okay, so into another gospel. You've so quickly turned away. You veered off into another gospel. Now, people have tried to use this phrase, is heteron evangelion, to kind of to sort of date Galatians. And they say, well, it must have been written shortly after, the Galatian Christians experienced conversion. But I mean, things like that, that's just obviously pure speculation, pure conjecture. But the larger point is that the term evangelion is an announcement of good news. And so the whole prepositional phrase is adverbial, and it's modifying is. It's modifying it's denoting purpose or goal. And so is heteron evangelion. We would, if we were going to diagram this prepositional phrase would be coming off this verb here. That's where we would stick that. We would say metatisteste, and then there's two prepositional phrases coming off that, and one is this one, apatu kalisantasimas, quickly turning away from, and quickly turning away unto another gospel. Okay, diagramming is very helpful, by the way. If you're trying to make sense of a section of Greek and you just are trying to understand what's going with what, diagramming is super helpful. So this is here denoting the purpose of the goal. So heteron. Let's just mention something about this word here. Heteron. We would say translate this as another. And then also we get down here. It says houk estin allo. These are synonyms, allo and heteron. In fact, in most English translations, both are translated as another. Turning away from the one who called you by the grace of Christ, or by grace, unto another gospel. And then he says, negative particle, which is not another. In both cases, an English translation will put another here, or in another here, sometimes over here, which is not, um, uh, you know, they say something like, from the one who called you by grace to another gospel, which is not another. So these are synonyms, but they're not to be equated. They're not like one for one. There is a difference between them. One example where you see both show up again is 2 Corinthians 11:4. And if you're interested in looking at that, you can see to preach another Jesus or another gospel is to have fallen away and done away with Christ, and that's why Paul's words are so serious here, um, about this. So we've really turned over Galatians 1:6 pretty thoroughly. Um, the only thing that I've not done here is show you a diagram with the text, but I'll do that in a minute. I'm just going to kind of show you how all these pieces sort of come together as a whole. But let's jump into verse 7 uh, and look at what's going on here. So we start with a relative pronoun, ho, and then a negative particle, and then a to be verb. And then you've got this you've got this adjective that again means another right here. And so he says, Houk esten alo. This is a rhetorical figure of speech where Paul is correcting himself. Uh, what grammarians call this epidiorthesis. Let's see if I can epidiorthesis. Epidiorthesis. An epidiorthesis is a rhetorical figure of speech where the author or the writer corrects himself. It's to say a wrong thing and then to correct it intentionally. And that's what Paul's doing here. It's really interesting. You see a lot of this in I've certainly seen a lot of this in Attic Greek. Less of it certainly in the New Testament, but it's a rhetorical device, and it's meant to elicit a point. It's a self-correction followed by an improved restatement. So we could paraphrase the verse this way. We could say, in reality, of course, there is no other gospel, but there are some who are troubling you, trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. So he's saying, you know, there in reality, he says, some are trying to the one who called you by his grace, and they're trying to turn you away into another gospel. But hey, guys, in reality, of course, there is no other gospel. Um, in other words, he's saying this is actually a nonsensical statement. There is no heteron evangelion. This is not possible. This is not something that's realistic. There's no such thing as a heteron evangelion. There's only one evangelion, and that comes from Christ. There is no other gospel. Period. Okay, so it's a interesting rhetorical use there. Paul's saying quite emphatically, there is no other gospel, but he uses this Greek style as a way to set up a bit of a rhetorical flourish in order to make his point more explicit. The relative pronoun, ho, here, this is going to function as a nominative subject of the to be verb here, of esten. And so then you have the adjective alo, which again means another. And he says, which is not another. Alo then is going to refer back to what's not another what? Well, it's referring back to gospel. It's not another gospel. And so and it's the predicate. So this would be allo would be the predicate. We would classify this grammatically as the predicate nominative of the a me verb. So with an a me verb, you anticipate that there could be, if you see a nominative to follow, that there could be a predicate nominative. So we've got a subject, we've got a copulative to be verb, and then you've got a predicate nominative to follow. And that's what we have here. And again, note the use of allo here instead of heteron in verse 6. So heteron evangelion highlights the difference between Paul's gospel and the one to which the Galatians are turning toward. Uk allo negates any similarity between the two. In other words, the different gospel is not another gospel at all. And then he uses this phrase here, which is another idiom in Greek, which is e me. E me. What does e me mean? Well, this Greek idiom is typically translated as except. It's like an exception clause. And so, I marvel that so quickly you're turning away from the one who called you by grace unto another gospel, which is no other gospel except, forgot the T there, except. And so let's just talk about that. So it's very similar to the Greek idiom. We see another one that's like e me, and the other one that it's similar to is eon me. Eon me, and we see this as well. Eon me, which this shows up quite a bit in the New Testament, and so it's similar. The only difference is e me. This one up here is less hypothetical, or this one is more hypothetical. You talk about hypothetical situation, and this one is more hypothetical. Eon me is more hypothetical, and this one is less hypothetical because it's dealing with real people in real circumstances. So when you see eon me, you're expecting real people, real circumstances. When you see eon me, it's even more hypothetical. And here, functionally, what's this doing functionally? We're talking about the function of this idiom. E may, why is he using it? Well, functionally, what it's doing is it's introducing an exception clause or a phrase. So he's saying we're talking about actual circumstances here and people and not just possibilities. And he says, except some people, okay, there are some people, namely the ones who are troubling you. Okay, there are some people who are the ones who are troubling you, and they're pretending that another gospel is the true gospel. He's saying no one would think of calling this substitute message good news, except unless they were people who were trying to pervert the gospel or trying to confuse Christians. And so this is not, he says, this is not another gospel. Except I do want you to know there are some people who want you to believe that this is the gospel, and therefore, in that sense, they're trying to actually pervert this gospel. Okay, so that's how it's almost like a negation. That's how e may is functioning here in the actual grammar, the grammatical sense of this verse. And then you have tenes. Tenes just right here. It just tenes just again. It's indefinite pronoun. It just comes from tis, and simply means someone, anyone, a certain one, or anyone. A lot of times, certain one. And here it shows up as the nominative subject of Estin. So this is going to be the subject of this to be verb. And not this one, not this estin here, but it's the subject of this estin here. Certain ones, and so it does not specify. It's interesting that he uses tenes here, someone, certain one, anyone, and he doesn't tell us who these are. He doesn't specify them by name, but he will get more specific later. But right now, he's just talking in generalities. And so he's going to just kind of leave us on a cliffhanger, if you will. So we're going to have to wait and find out, well, who exactly is he referring to when we get into the second, part of the letter itself. Now, that's a lot, and I'm just going to stop because we're coming up on an hour, and we've been looking through these verses 6 and 7 pretty analytically. We've been looking pretty in depth at what's happening here grammatically. So let me just stop us here, and in the next video, which will be shorter than this one, we'll go ahead and look at the rest of verse 7 and consider the grammar that's there as well.